A bloodbath tonight in the rural town of Chinook.
Everyone here is hiding a secret.
4 more victims found scattered.
Some worse than others.
I came as fast as I could. I'm Deputy Ruth Vogel.
And soon, my quiet life will never be the same.
Realm presents a 30 Ninjas production, Chinook, starring Kelly Marie Tran and Sanaa Lathan. Listen to Chinook wherever you get your podcasts.
Hi, I'm Jennifer, a co-founder of the Go Kid Go network. At Go Kid Go, putting kids first is at the heart of every show that we produce. That's why we're so excited to introduce a brand new show to our network called The Search for the Silver Lining, a fantasy adventure series about a spirited young girl named Isla who time travels to the mythical land of Camelot. During her journey, Isla meets new friends, including King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table, and learns valuable life lessons with every quest, sword fight, and dragon ride. Positive and uplifting stories remind us all about the importance of kindness, friendship, honesty, and positivity. Join me and an all-star cast of actors including Liam Neeson, Emily Blunt, Kristen Bell, Chris Hemsworth, among many others, in welcoming the Search for the Silver Lining podcast to the Go Kid Go network by listening today. Look for the Search for the Silver Lining on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello and welcome to Vulgar History, a feminist women's history comedy podcast. My name is Anne Foster, and this week we are talking about La Quintrala, who, that is how she's known. That's kind of the name by which she is best known in Chile, for that is where this story takes place. Her real name is Catalina de los Rios y Lisperger, and how did she become La Quintrala is what we're going to talk about in this episode. It's kind of like there's the real person who lived, and then there's the monster, La Quintrala. And that is what her real story is, maybe somewhere in the middle of those two things. And so this is a listener suggestion. Javi is the name of the person who suggested this. I believe Javi is a listener from Chile. And a while back, I had said on the podcast that I really was hoping to find some more suggestions of people from South America, from Central America, from the Western Hemisphere. I haven't talked about a lot of them on the show, and I'm really eager to learn about them and find people who would be suitable for a Vulgar History episode. And so Javi sent me information about La Quintrala. I was like, oh man, this sounds so interesting. And just from what I was first finding, the vibes I was getting were really Elizabeth Bathory coded, where it's like, this was this woman and she killed thousands of people, and isn't this terrible? But there was kind of like not a lot of evidence that that is what a real person who actually lived in the world did. And so I was poking around a bit more, hoping to find a bit more information. And what I found was a paper from 2019 from a journal called History Compass, and the author is Maria Marsilli. And so I looked up to see Maria and if she would be someone who'd be interested in coming on the show, and she was very enthusiastic about it. So Maria is an associate professor in the history department at John Carroll University in Ohio, and she grew up in Chile, and she's always had an interest in La Quintrala. We talk about in this episode how she remembers hearing about it as a child and kind of what her journey has been. Like, if anyone knows about the real person and also about the monster, it's really Maria. So I was so happy that she came to join me on the podcast to help explain the story, kind of the myth and the legend and the real person, and just to situate this in the context of other episodes we've done on the podcast. So Catalina, aka La Quintrala, she was born in 1604 in Chile. And so that's about 100 years after Malintzin, aka La Malinche, was born in what is now Mexico. So this is when Catalina La Quintrala was born. This is about 100 years into Spanish people colonizing South America region. So that's the colony has been there for quite a while. It's got its own identity, as we're going to talk about. This is also around the same time. So La Quintrala, born 1604, Catalina de Arauso, who we did a podcast on a while back, who was a Spanish person who came over to kind of terrorize around, where did Catalina go? Peru. And anyway, so Catalina was kind of in this colonial era as well. So if you remember that it was a bit of a the closest thing I can think of to compare to is like the American Wild West. It's just kind of these colonies were just doing their own thing, not necessarily representing Spain, which is what they had been founded to do, but really just kind of enriching the wealthy elites, subjugating the local indigenous people. And that's kind of the world that La Quintrala came from. So I was so delighted to have Maria come on to help explain the story that she's so knowledgeable about and so passionate about. So please enjoy this discussion with Maria Marsilli. So I'm so happy today to be joined by Maria Marsilli, who is here to talk about one of her main, a person you said that it's one of your fascinations. So I'm happy to have you here. Welcome, Maria.
Thank you. Thank you, Anne, for the invitation. I really appreciate this. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this topic of my research.
So first of all, can you set the scene for everybody? We're talking about, so it's Chile. It's the early 1600s is when she was born. And so what was the situation there? How long had it been colonized? Who had colonized it? What was going on?
Yeah, let me try to dissect the question into two areas. So one is the actual facts, the historical facts, which are very much set in Chile's 17th century. The complement to that situation is Chile 19th century, which is when the father of Chilean historiography, a guy named Benjamin Vicuña Maquena, created the icon for Chilean audiences. So there are two separate yet intertwined situations that we need to figure out in order to see how the icon of the monster was created.
Exactly. That's how I wanted to talk about it. There's who is the person and then who is the monster? What's the myth and what do we actually know? Yeah.
Correct. And if we do have time, and I would like also to touch on the role of monstrosity, why monsters are important and what specific elements of the political agenda in 19th century Chile these monsters serves. So let us start with the colonial situation first. So the historical person who is going to give the basis to the monster, we know who she was. Her name was Doña Catalina de los Ríos y Lisperger. She lived between 1605 and 1665 in central Chile. And she was a wealthy lady of the Chilean colonial elite. She was part of a very extended clan in the colony, which was the Lisperger clan, which it was a family clan that had German origins, and that's part of the why this topic is so interesting. Something that we need to keep in mind here is that at this time, industrial societies, people go through life in their family clans. So what mattered, your center of affiliation was your clan, your extended family. Not so much the local government, the national government, or even the king, which was a distant figure in this remote colony. What mattered in the life of individuals was who your father was, who your uncle was, who your mother was, and what kind of connections could your family, extended family, build in order to ensure that you survive in this situation. So you go through life being the daughter of, the husband of, the wife of, and what matters is what can you do in order to make sure that your clan, as an extended family, survives. So that's the sort of social environment. As per the economic environment, we are talking about a remote Chile, central Chile, in the 17th century, so which is a remote province of the Spanish Empire that is at war, constant war against the natives. This is the ultimate frontier of the empire, right? So there is a little bit south of Santiago, it's war territory. And this territory is controlled by the natives, who, for lack of, there are many ways to call them, but for lack of a better name, we can give them the collective noun of Mapuches. So the Mapuches are in control of pretty much southern Chile. And this tiny colony is trying to survive with assistance from the central government, from the king in Spain, but in constant war against these natives who resist colonization, resist Christianization, evangelization, and you name it. These natives epitomize everything that is quote unquote pagan, everything that is bad, everything that is backward, and they oppose the expansion of the bad. So in this situation of constant war, we have in the cities, or the main city in the colony, which is Santiago, where Doña Catalina lived, we have the creation of an elite that that builds its identity on this situation of war. How good you are in advancing the interests of the Spanish Empire, how many natives have you killed, and how loyal you are to the cause of the empire. So in this situation, this kind of society does not recognize itself because it's not in their best interest as a mixed race society. You are Hispanic, Catholic, white, Christian, loyal subject to the king, or at least this is what you say, or you're native, bad, pagan, backward, savage. So in that dichotomy that dichotomy is what we need to use to understand Chilean society at the time and the milieu in which Doña Catalina, the real Doña Catalina, lived. This is also a very, in modern terms, we would call it corrupt society. The royal administration, particularly in these remote locations, was subject to all forms of engage in all kinds of corruption. So all kind of favors and agreements that were not part of the duties, of the administrative duties of these authorities, were the norm. And all these clans competed to get a favorable treatment in the eyes of these administrators. So, and the Lisperger family, of which Doña Catalina was a member, was no exception. So everybody all families, all extended families are doing exactly the same as her family is doing and what she's doing as part of this competitive landscape. So I guess that depicts the kind of situation in colonial Chile in the 17th century. Something that is important, I believe, and I try to emphasize it in my own research, is that in this kind of society, and other historians have said it better than me, in this kind of society, race mixing, although race mixing is happening, and historians do agree that race mixing happened since day one, since the first Europeans arrived. Race mixing is, however, not recognized. Again, because of the situation of war, you are either a native, a pagan, a bad person, or a Catholic, European, white, good person. But the in-betweenness of race mixing is not recognized. It's not something that people want to talk about or even see. So I guess that describes the situation in colonial times. Let us quickly move to mid of the 19th century, which is when the icon of the monster is created. And we know exactly who created it. This Benjamin Vicuña Maquena, who is recognized and celebrated as the founding father of Chilean historiography. He created the monster. And the process by which he created the monster is also fascinating. So he presented Doña Catalina as La Quintrala right away in 1877 specifically. And he was a very prolific historian, journalist, novelist, and he wrote amazingly well. So in the 19th century, these newly independent countries are trying to create an identity for themselves, a national identity. And in the process, and this is also a fascinating topic, in the process of doing so, the written word is fundamental. So intellectuals writing, intellectuals creating his stories, that would serve as a sort of platform in which everybody can identify themselves, in this case as Chileans, is fundamental. So this is exactly what Vicuña Maquena is doing. He is feeding his audience with stories that are somehow grounded in coloniality, but serve as an instrument of education of these newly independent citizens, particularly male citizens, because those are the men are those who run the government, right? So he creates this monster, this monstrous woman, and he's very open. He starts the narrative. He introduces first the monster of La Quintrala to Chilean audiences in a very specific way, which is, I think the word in English is folietin. It's the kind of serialized stories that appear in newspapers. So not the news itself, but the appendix that are sort of mini stories like soap operas of the time that are included in each day of the newspaper.
Sorry, there's something happening on your screen. It's okay, listeners, we were being haunted by La Quintrala. But now we're back. So you were talking about in the historian and the creation of the Chilean national identity, which somehow involved inventing this monster narrative.
I was saying, Benjamin Vicuña Maquena introduced the monster via a very specific tool of mass media communication, which was a newspaper to begin with. But within the newspaper, the section called folietin, which is a serialized narrative, included at the end of each edition. And this idea is important because this kind of serial deliveries added to the newspaper, they have a very specific targeted audience, which is first of all women, and second, young readers. So young, inexperienced readers. And women who are inexperienced readers by definitions in the 19th century would be the main readers of this first delivery of the monster. And La Quintrala is an immediate success. And people keep asking more details about this monster to the author. So the author, at the end of the same year, at the end of 1877, he puts out a book. And see, if you notice the switch to the audience, books are the kind of readings that educated men would engage. So he switches from uneducated audiences who love it to educated audiences, men, which is fascinating in itself. So he publishes a book with the title Los Lisperger and La Quintrala, and which is basically a genealogy of the Lisperger clan that depicts the sort of Baroque environment that was 17th century Chilean society.
So was the Lisperger clan they were well known at the time, or later on? This clan, you said that the family was so important, and this was one of the prominent families.
Yes, it was one of the most prominent families in the colonial society. And Vicuña Maquena, being a member of the Chilean elite in the 19th century, somehow connected by her voice to these stories. He knew about this. So he is in his narrative. He basically says openly that it's very basically that his depiction of the monster is basically based on hearsay, folk tales, and stories that he heard as a child. He's very open about that. Yet he engages because he's talking to an educated audience now in the book. He engages the best he can archival documentation to demonstrate all the evil activities of Doña Catalina, aka La Quintrala.
So he's saying that these are stories. So he'd heard the stories before. He wasn't inventing them. He was just sharing a story that already invented, that existed.
Yeah. But because his audience is an educated audience now, he needs to somehow put some validity in the form of documentation. And he's very explicit about this as well. The guy was a masterful writer. He's very explicit about that. He says, you know what? I know I should be showing to you documentation about all the crimes committed by this woman. But there is no documentation. Guess why? Because her clan was so connected to the high spheres of the law in the colony that they covered up all her crimes. So the notion of corruption of the judicial colonial system comes very prominently in Vicuña Maquena's writing. So he says basically, yeah, believe me, she committed all these crimes, but I cannot show you documentation because all these crimes were covered up by the judges who were basically bought by the Lisperger clan, which is a very convenient way for a historian to say, yeah, believe me, there should be documentation, but there is none because of the corruption of the system. The truth was that the system was corrupt. In the colonial administration in Chile was extremely corrupt. And there is a historian who makes a very good point about this, is the notion of cooptation. The colony of Chile during colonial times was very well known for exercising the process of cooptation of authorities coming from Spain to rule the colony. And they were, new administrators coming to the colony were warned very explicitly about how keenly this local elite is going to try to get you to be part of their businesses. So this summer, for instance, I was doing my own research, trying to find some form of documentation about all the alleged crimes that Vicuña Maquena said Doña Catalina committed. And I found instead a lot of crimes committed by the clan, by the Lisperger clan, of which Doña Catalina was an active member, a prominent member. And the crimes, all the crimes that this family committed were very much geared towards cooptation of the local authorities, the administrators sent by the crown. So we can talk about that, or we can go into the alleged crimes of La Quintrala. Up to you.
I think what would be good for the listeners right now is to explain the monster, to explain what the crimes are. This is where, when I first started just doing a little bit of reading about her, everything you just said about how there's no proof seemed so confusing to me, because I was reading, she did this, but there's no actual, she was never taken to prison for any of these things.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, did she do these things? I love that you, like, even today, you're trying to find evidence and it's hard to find. So yes, explain the monster, and also, I guess, both just how little children hear the story probably still today. Okay. Like, what is the story that people know?
Okay, so today La Quintrala is kind of an evil ghost that is kind of the boogeyman. I was born and raised in Chile, so I was threatened myself with La Quintrala. So Maria, if you don't eat your veggies, La Quintrala is going to come after you, because she is the encapsulation of all the kind of punishment that you can receive if you commit a transgression. And the notion of transgression is kind of very neat in this whole story as well. So La Quintrala is the kind of encapsulation of all that can be wrong with a woman. So she's encapsulation of sexual transgression, proclivity to commit violent acts, greed because it's supposedly this woman did commit all these crimes just out of pure the fact that she was bad to the bone. I think I started my piece with the story of middle-aged architect in Chile who in 2014, I want to say, was found guilty of paying a sicario to kill somebody, her former husband. And she was arrested and put to trial, found guilty. And right away, Chilean newspapers nicknamed her La Quintrala. So it's the bad woman who commits violent crimes and that do the best. That's the best to get away with it. So the notion of impunity, committing crimes because you're bad, because you're greedy, because you're sexually unrestrained, and do the best to try to get away with it is also part of, an important component of the monster. I personally think that the notion of impunity runs very deep in the collective imagination of Chilean society, even today. The notion that somebody can be bad, commit horrible things, and yet get away with it I'm thinking about Pinochet's dictatorship, for instance. It's very prominent into the collective imagination of what can happen in Chile. And La Quintrala fits into that profile to the T. So on top of that, she is also, the ghost of La Quintrala is supposed to be one of the many manifestations of the devil itself. And so practitioners of black magic, for instance, to use the ghost of La Quintrala to give power to the rituals that they're performing. So it's kind of an omnipresent presence in Chilean pop culture, popular culture today. That is the today, the monster, the ghost today. In Vicuña Maquena's narrative, the crimes that Doña Catalina committed, but of which there are no proof, documental proof, were several. So according to him, let me see, I have the list of the bad things that she was said to have done. She poisoned her father when she was a teenager. And the reason why she poisoned her father, said Vicuña Maquena, it was because she was reaching teenage years. Her hormones were running wild, and her father wanted to sexually constrain her. And so in response, she killed the father. After that, she goes on to have many lovers. And so she basically sleeps with whichever man she wants to sleep with, and gets away with it because she kills them after, having sex with her. So as a way to protect her reputation, she basically kills all her lovers. Another crime that she committed was, and this is probably the only transgression that so far I found documentation for. And according to Vicuña Maquena, she killed by torture hundreds of her workers in her landed estate.
Can we talk about, the workers, like enslaved people, are these Africans or are these
the
Mapuche? Okay.
They're Mapuches. So they're Mapuches who live in this European control area of the colony, but they're also African slaves. So that's the workforce that the landed elite has at its disposal in Chile. And Doña Catalina had a number of workers as well. So and according to Vicuña Maquena, she tortured. The notion of killing by torture is also a component in Chilean imagination, by the way. So according to Vicuña Maquena, she because of her own sadism, she killed them by torturing them endlessly. And she killed many, according to Vicuña Maquena. And she got, of course, that was against the law. But she was brought to trial, said Vicuña Maquena, but she got away with it because of all the influences of the Lisberger clan.
So this actually did occur? She did?
That's a good question.
Okay, we'll get to that, yeah.
The other crime, of course, was spiritual crime. Oh, that's my God, I'm sorry. The other crime was of a spiritual transgression, in which she, of course, was a witch. And she had, she combined in her practice, the historian, and this is kind of interesting, native witchcraft with African witchcraft. And in that mixing, also, she had made a pact with the devil, which made her a very powerful witch in the colony. So she was definitely a force to fear. And I think that's the list of all the crimes that she was supposed to have committed.
I have a question about just because one of the examples that I heard, I first heard of La Quintrala because a listener from Chile suggested that this could be a good episode, and it is. And the story that she told me that she's heard is that La Quintrala, she was torturing one of her workers in a room where there was a giant, you're nodding, a statue of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And then she had the statue removed or something.
Yeah.
Can you relate that story?
That's another story that's again promoted by Vicuña Maquena. She was torturing one of her workers, and when in the process she was, of course, she had the appearance of being a very Catholic lady. So the appearance of piety was important in the whole Chilean society. So she had a crucifix attached to one of her walls. And when she was torturing the worker, she looked at the crucifix and she saw, says the story goes, she sees the face of Jesus, right, looking at her with horror because of what she was doing. So she stops punishing the worker and she turns to the crucifix. And she grabs the crucifix and throws the crucifix out of her house. And she says, and this is very, very important, get away from here, talking to Jesus, of course. And she says, because I don't want men looking at me with a weird face in my house, or something like that. No quiero hombres que me miren con mala cara en mi casa, something like that. So it's a clear statement. Right, this is my house. I do in my house what I want. I'm the master of my own private sphere. Religion has no business here, and Jesus has no business here. So I proceed to throw you away. It's a clear representation that she has turned totally and completely to the dark side. Right. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's a good point. I was forgetting that the story of the crucifix. But the story goes that the crucifix was picked up by the Augustinians, and they put it in a church, and then there's a big earthquake that comes, and everything is destroyed back for the wall that holds the crucifix. So it's a clear representation that the crucifix indeed had been blessed by God, and that that made the point even clearer that La Quintrala was evil. Mm-hmm. Right, because the crucifix is protected by God in a big earthquake, and while La Quintrala had thrown it away out of her house. So that's an important element. Thanks to your reader for bringing that point up.
Yeah, no, and she mentioned that too. That she said men aren't going to look at me like that in my own house, which is
yeah.
So it's So these stories, I can see why when they were serialized first, I think the readers every week would be excited to hear what new terrible thing did this person do if everything is so extreme.
Yeah, well, let me go back a little bit to the story of the workers, because that's the only direct piece of documentation so far that I found in the archives that clarifies the point. So there was a legal investigation because not hundreds, but 40 workers had died of illness, of a plague, in the landed state of Doña Catalina. And there was an investigation because it was, of course, against the law to punish your workers or to mistreat your workers, although labor laws were very loosely enforced in colonial Chile. So we're talking about 40 people who apparently died out of malnutrition or illness or during that particular winter. There was an investigation, but the judge following the investigation did not find any conclusive evidence that it was the personal flaw of Doña Catalina. To which Vicuña Maquena would argue, you see, there's a whole system of corruption protecting her and her family. So that's the reason why we don't have evidence.
So you're saying you've done these investigations to try and find evidence one way or the other about what she did. But what do we know about the real person?
What do we know about the real person? And that's another component, and probably the one of the main points in my own research. What do we know about her? We know that she was a wealthy lady, that she married only once, and her husband died very, very early into the marriage, and she remained a widow, which was kind of not the norm. Yeah, women were supposed to marry and stay, and if the husband died, they were supposed to marry again, because women needed to be under the control or the protection of a male, right? Contrary to that, she is a widow. She remained a widow for a long time. It has been said that she was a very beautiful lady, and that she, in her complexion, it was clear that she was mixed race, and as in having sort of native features in her face and skin, yet have red hair, which was extremely uncommon in the Spanish Empire in general, and specifically in this remote colony. So that the mixing, that talks deeply about race mixing, right? About her condition of, and the word in Spanish is mestizo, as somebody who has mixed heritage. And she was a wealthy, independent, resourceful widow who happened to be a mixed race woman. And Vicuña Maquena is very intentional about this. He says quite open that La Quintrala was evil. First of all, because she was a woman, in power, which was one of the horrors that the colonial system allowed. The colonial system allowed women to be in power, and which was true. Historically, we know that the Spanish Empire allowed women to be in power, to have power over their economic decisions, about their domestic sphere, and to exercise economic agency. Women could do that, even if they didn't have a husband, next to them. So La Quintrala is evil because she's a woman, because she's wealthy, because she has power, because she exercises agency, because she's independent. But most importantly, said Vicuña Maquena, she's evil because she's mixed race. So it's the condition of being a mestiza that makes her particularly bad. Although that exacerbates her evilness, which is true. She, in her clan, we have German origins on her two sides, on her maternal and paternal side, by the way. And we have certainly Mapuche origins, and that's another interesting element in her. She was the granddaughter of a cacique. Caciques are native chiefs in central Chile, and we have the name of this cacica, Doña Águida Flores, who was the daughter of and listen to this is native elite as good as it gets. So Doña Catalina's grandmother was the daughter of an Inca appointed chief in the area at the time when the first Spaniards arrived. So this daughter of the native leader marries a German guy who happens to be Bartolome Blumen, who later Hispanized his name to Flores. So we have on one side already German roots, Germans mixing with natives. On the other side of her family, we also have German, and there is the Lisperger. That is the Lisperger element of the family. And in that case, we're talking about Peter Lisperger, who was a page to Charles V. So we're talking about Germans ranking very high in the colonial administration that then are sent to the frontier of the empire to, again, preserve Spanish control there. And in the process, they get mixed with the local elite. So in there, and of course, there is the Spanish component, also on another venue that runs in her plan. So that combination of Spanish, native, and German heritage, says Vicuña Maquena, is what makes her specifically evil. Because it's mestizaje, right? It's race mixing as good as it gets. And race mixing is something that was not supposed to happen, was not meant to happen in a colony that was constantly at war and that put in one side the bad native and the good Spaniard or the good European. So the crossing, the in-betweenness, is what makes her particularly bad, particularly evil.
So is that partially, when he was writing it, McKenna, sort of these were things that his readers would already be suspicious about. So he knew that if he says it's an independent woman, mixed race, he knew that the readers would think, oh, of course she's evil. Those things.
Of course she has to be bad. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it's because they mixed race in Chile, even today, I mean, talking today, almost everybody is mixed race. Almost like in any other part of Latin America, almost everybody is mixed race. But Chileans, I would presume, because of the situation of war that marks so deeply colonial times in Chile, in Chilean society, there is the idea that Chileans are whiter than everybody else in Latin America, which is, of course, not true. But not only that, but the Chilean, and there are several articles and studies early in the 20th century that talk about how the Chilean quote-unquote race is the most homogeneous race everywhere that you can possibly find anywhere in the entire planet, which of course is an exaggeration. But the idea that Chilean society is more European than any other society in Latin America, maybe with the exception of Argentinians, it runs very deep into the way in which Chileans still today recognize themselves to be like. So by making this monster in the 19th century, remember the 19th century is a period when historians, particularly historians, are sort of laying the foundations of national identities in these newly independent countries. When a historian grabs the notion of mestizaje and adds into the creation of this monster that he offers to his readers as a lesson, because she serves as a monster to educate Vicuña Maquena's audiences, they would recognize, oh yeah, mestizaje was so bad. It never happened. It was a horror, but when it did happen, look what it did to people, particularly to women, who were allowed to run without control in the colonial times. So that is a mistake that we should not repeat in the organization of this newly independent republic. So that is the educational angle I think Vicuña Maquena intended to use when he adds the notion of Doña Catalina Veina Mestiza, which is I find fascinating.
Well, and as you said, there is so much race mixing, but to use her as a warning or to show this is why you shouldn't do it because your child will be a monster like she was. Although I have no proof that she was a monster, she was.
Yeah, that's a good point. She was. It doesn't matter. In that sense, when we think in those terms, evidence is irrelevant, right? Because she is a monster for what she is. And therefore, as a monster, she had to have committed bad crimes because she's a monster, right? So it's a catch-22. So I have a list of what I think is what Vicuña Maquena wanted to teach his 19th century audiences. Remember, in the book, he's addressing now men, educated men, who are the who is the political elite that is going to run the country during the 19th century and much of the 20th century. So this is, I would say that this is what Vicuña Maquena wanted to instruct his audience about. First of all, he wanted to teach them about all the bad things that or the dangers of colonial past. Remember, this newly independent countries want to put aside the colonial past. And so all the dangers, all the corruption of the colonial past is something that should not be replicated in the new governments. They needed, in creating the monster, Vicuña Maquena was also trying to educate women and girls of the proper way. I mean, how a woman should behave in this new society, which is basically, among other things, to be the mothers of the importance of women in these newly independent societies is not to be political agents, it's not to be economic agents, is to have children, to be confined to the domestic sphere, have children, and educate those children, particularly their boys, into the proper ways of being a citizen. So mothers of male citizens is the kind of target that we need to emphasize in young girls. Another component is that in characterizing natives as evil, because La Quintrala is evil, also because she was part native, in characterizing natives as evil, as backward. Vicuña Maquena makes clear the point that in the 19th century, what the Chilean government needs to do is basically eradicate all native people. Remember, in the 19th century, the war against the Mapuches is still going on. Mm-hmm. And some political scientists, and I would say that is still going on, right? That the war of Arauco, the war against the Mapuches, has not finished. So the solution that the political elite was proposing in the 19th century, Vicuña Maquena, of which Vicuña Maquena was part of, he was also a politician, was to basically commit genocide and kill all natives and open those lands for European immigrants. So Chile was engaged in a policy of immigration, clear immigration. What kind of immigrants do we want to bring to these Mapuche lands? Where we need to bring white Catholic Europeans. That was very clear. And Vicuña Maquena was very active in that. He openly called for the genocide, for the killing of natives. Another element that the monsters served Vicuña Maquena to educate his audiences was in the negation of race mixing. The natives are separated from the whites. There was no race mixing. Chilean society is not the result of mestizaje in any shape, way, or form. I think an important point here also is that, which is another fascinating angle, and it's what monsters are there for. Why do we need monsters? I teach a class on monstrosity, and my students get it most of the time, I think, or I would like to think. We need monsters because monsters are constantly telling us the limits, right, of what we are not. And so as a society, and I'm using Cohen, of course, here, as a society, we need to have a monster constantly, presented to us as a reminder of what we are, because we are not like that. So it shows the limits of social possibilities. If you transgress, if you surpass that limit, you become a monster, and you are something that you should not be. So the monster shows us the limits of possibilities that a society should keep. And that's why we need monsters so badly. And that's why we like monsters so much, right? And that's why Vicuña Maquena's audiences were fascinated by this, Gothic monster, because this is what La Quintrala, the icon, was a Gothic monster who commits all sorts of crimes. And in so doing, the monster shows 19th century Chileans what you should not be and what happens to you when you transgress, you trespass this kind of limits of sociability, which I think is the ultimate tool of La Quintrala as an icon, as it was created.
That's so interesting what you said, everything you said, but we need monsters as a cautionary tale to show if you transgress, if you go beyond, this is what happens. You become, oh, here's your cat. Not a monster, very adorable.
No.
So it's interesting to me because just on this podcast, I've been looking at women from history in all different countries, and often I have found a widow or a landowner who's a woman not necessarily becomes a monster, as happens with Catalina, but that scene is so suspicious and so strange, and people in the time were almost frightened of a woman having this power. So do you know in her, as much as you can know, in her life, was before she became the monster, was she a scandalous figure in Chile? Did people think, this is weird, she should have married, why is she a widow, why does a widow have a landowner?
Correct. Maybe not so much in colonial society. We don't know how many rich widows were around in colonial society. We need to presume that there were not that many. Maybe they were. We know very little about women in power during colonial times, as we know very little about women in power in pre-colonial times. So the fact that, for instance, her maternal grandmother was a very prominent native chief on her own rights indicates that in pre-Columbian times, in this specific region, but probably in most of Latin America today, there were women in power. And we know that the case for the Peruvian viceroyalty, for instance, during the process of the conquest itself, we know about female native chiefs who sided with Pizarro's troops. So the option to be a woman and to have political power and to control men was open in colonial times. We know that colonial times, in pre-Columbian times, we know that in colonial times that option was also available, that a woman was allowed to, for instance, keep control of her own dowry according to the Spanish law. So, for instance, if at the time when women married during colonial Spanish administration, there was a dowry that went from the father of the woman to the bride, right? One of the reasons for divorce, for instance, and probably the only reason for divorce, was if, as the wife realizes that the husband, who is supposed to be the one who administers the dowry, and is allowing the dowry to lose some value, that's a reason for divorce, because the dowry is property of the woman. It's administered by the husband, but property of the woman. Mm-hmm. And the woman is the owner of that source of wealth at all times. So that indicates that certain degree of economic agency was allowed during colonial times to women. So under that perspective, a widow, when a woman becomes a widow, according to Spanish law, she can run her own business. So Doña Catalina, in that sense, being a rich widow, was not so exceptional as Vicuña Maquena wanted it to appear. It probably sounded exceptional to his readers in the 19th century because a lot had changed in Chilean society. But maybe it was not as weird, as hard to find in colonial times as the historian wants us to believe. As per the accusation of witchcraft, it is sort of also textbook, right? Who are the witches? Witches are, by definition, all women. That is, women who have passed their reproductive life. And that's a component there of patriarchalism working as good as it gets. So when you reach a certain time in your life when you no longer can have children, you sort of fall into the weird category, right? Witches are also women who live, I'm talking about the sort of traditional view of the witch, that are women who live in the borders of towns or in the woods, let us say. So therefore, they don't share the social space with everybody else. And therefore, they're all, or they can no longer have children, they're weird, they live outside society, they live without the control of a man. Therefore, they had to be doing something wrong. And Doña Catalina fits into that profile, with the aggravation that she doesn't live outside society. She doesn't live in the borders of colonial society. She lives in the center of colonial society, and her own clan is very powerful. The Lisbergers are very powerful in colonial Chile. So in a way, she was the perfect candidate, right, for Vicuña Maquena to pick her and turn her into the monster that would serve to educate his audiences in the 19th century.
Do you think when he said that these were stories he heard and now he's sharing them with other people, do you think that's true? Do you think there was the legend of the monster before he wrote these stories?
Yeah, probably. I think it's the kind of stories that you tell children, because Vicuña Maquena says in the introduction to his book, he's very open, and he says that these are stories that I heard from the servants in my own house when I was eating with them in the kitchen. So he's very open about that. This was a folk tale circulating in Chile for a long, long time that he picked, and he adds some historical components, and he presented as an educational tool for his audiences. Something that is important to keep in mind here, I think, is that the story is fundamental. When you have a good story, you have a good story, and you can keep your audiences captive. And Vicuña Maquena knew that. He was a magnificent writer, and Vicuña Maquena knew that. So he had the perfect story. He had the story would fascinate his readers. So yeah, keep telling that story.
That's interesting, the angle that he said the servants, that's where he heard the story, because then there's an element of the oral storytelling that you often find in a lot of North American indigenous cultures, South American, like societies where there's not necessarily a written record, but these oral stories. And so I could see if there was a horrible, a specifically notable wealthy person who was mistreating their workers, those workers would tell other workers, they would tell their children. So I can see that that's how the story, even if she's outside, that would make sense why it's outside of the bounds of justice.
Yeah, the fact that the story of the monster that Vicuña Maquena picks as a child, it comes from the servants, right? So it comes from the popular classes, in which oral communication is what matters most, contrary. So in that sense, the whole story might be encapsulated as the transition from an oral story into the written communication, which is in itself also is a fascinating process, how societies transition from communicating mostly orally into writing, right? Where information, when you transmit information orally, people can add. It's like the telephone game. You can add. People can add details, but when you put it in writing, the process became more normalized. You can, yes, certainly you can add more details to a piece of written information, but there is documentation of who's adding. While in the process of orally transmitting information, you don't know who's adding, you don't know who's putting something extra. And so the notion of ownership of information is very fast in societies that transmit information orally versus societies that transmit information in written. So, yeah, that's a fascinating element. Thank you, and you gave me something to think about.
Well, and then also just from what I've been reading about this story and the way that it's shared, there's been telenovelas. I think there's been movies, which I would imagine, again, the same way that this story, was coming out in the newspaper, just a little piece at a time, and people are so invested. I can see it's such a good story. Like, of course, I'm sure it would be very exciting as a telenovela.
And there were, to my knowledge, there have been 2 telenovelas on La Quintrala. Maybe there is a third one. I don't know. I'm going to Chile in April, so I'll check on that. The first one that I know as a telenovela was during dictatorship. Was produced and put out during dictatorship, and some political scientists made the point that, like, by Pinochet's dictatorship, putting the story of this sadistic woman out for mass consumption was a way to sort of distract the attention of the crimes being committed at that specific time by the government and safely projected them into the past. So, which is, this is a very good strategy to deviate attention, right? And at the same time to normalize crimes. The second story came out in I want to say 2010, also telenovela, but in that case it emphasized more it was a late show, so it emphasized more the sexual component of La Quintrala. It was meant for more adult audiences. That was done for 2010 for the bicentennial celebration of independence. And in that case, there was a historian running the show, kudos, finally. And the name of the historian is Manuel Vicuña, who's a very good, very, very good Chilean historian who happened to be a descendant of Benjamin Vicuña Maquena. And in that episode, Manuel Vicuña makes a very clear point about the condition of Doña Catalina as a mestiza woman. So kudos. I think in that case, the historian is putting the attention, is placing his attention in the right areas, right? We need to add ethnicity and the mixed ethnicity of the character into the construction of the icon first, but also to think that maybe race mixing was not that uncommon. And we know, demographic historians do know, they have made the point that race mixing was not that uncommon at all, and it happens since day one. Yet, the Chilean colonial society refused to accept it and recognize themselves as mestizos.
And the way at the very beginning of this conversation, when you were describing the culture was so much, this is the colonial, the European Catholic people, and then here's the Mapuche, the Incas, the indigenous people, were so separate. That's how the Europeans wanted it to seem, but that was never the case. There was always the mixing.
Oh, yeah. There are, in the case of the Peruvian viceroyalty, there are monumental works on the notion of mestizaje. Because probably Peru, and we're jumping to Peru, but that's fine. Probably because the viceroyalty of Peru, of which Chile was a province, was immensely rich and immensely important geopolitically for the Spanish Empire. We have far more documentation about this race mixing in the case of Peru. We do know, and there is no reason to think that Chile was different, we do know that Spaniards mixed and married or not married very prominent Incan daughters of Incan administrators. So the alliance at the level of the elites was a governmental policy since day one. So there's a first generation of mixed race people who are a novelty, right? And among them, for instance, Inca Garcilaso de la Vega is the prominent writer of Spanish golden age, is a fundamental, is a novelty because he's one of the first mestizos. But after that first generation, when all the Spaniards were having children with native ladies, mestizos were not novelty anymore. Mestizos were the norm. And in the case of Peruvian history, it has been documented very clearly how mestizaje was the norm. Now, if that happened in the center of Spanish administration, there is no reason not to think that it was also happening. And we know it was also happening in the remote areas of the Peruvian viceroyalty, right? Like in the case of Chile. What is different in the case of Chile is the situation of war. And that makes a whole difference. Because, as you said, war places these two parties as completely separated from each other, constantly killing each other at odds. There is no way to solve this problem. And as a matter of fact, the war against the Mapuches was not sorted out. It was not solved during the 19th century and during the 20th century. And as I said, there is reason to believe that the war still goes on against Mapuche people. So in a society that separates these two elements, these two fundamentally different players, it is the sort of the sitting ground to think that there is no mixing, right? Because those two enemies cannot mix. And they're so radically different from each other. Well, the truth is that race mixing and cultural exchanges and the cultural in-betweenness happens in all kinds of situations, war included, right? So wars are also a powerful situation in which cultural exchanges can take place. And race mixing does take place. We do know that. But it was important, I would say, for colonial Chileans not to recognize it. Mm-hmm. And for 19th century intellectuals like Vicuña Maquena to negate that openly and make of that race mixing a component of monstrosity.
Right. As though they're saying, race mixing, it happened once and it led to this monster and that's it. Yeah. And that's it. We should not allow it to happen. Because look at the one time it happened. Mm-hmm. Look at what happened. And on top of that, she was a woman. Look what happened. Particularly to women, to the female, right? What was the hypocritical situation of this whole speech is that at the same time that mestizaje and the targeting of natives as inherently backward, mean, bad, not able to be civilized, is happening among intellectuals. Some of these intellectuals, like Vicuña Maquena himself, who happen to be politicians, are advocating for the genocide of native people, so which they cynically call the pacification of Araucania, which was a very well crafted campaign to basically kill these people, kill any Mapuche that you could find, any native that you could find, sort of to open this huge piece of Chile to business, to agrarian business. And so this is what is at stake, basically, in the political agenda of Vicuña Maquena. And now we're just going to take a break for a word from our sponsors.
Talmor, Talmor is my home. My family have worked the land for generations. My gran says the island does not belong to us, but we belong to the island. And we must be ready, for a great evil is coming, and death follows with it.
Listen and subscribe to the latest season of Undertow, The Harrowing, a Storyglass production presented by Realm, available wherever you get your podcasts.
Do you know what lies within nothing?
No.
Do you know where it ends? Do you want to know?
Yes.
Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.
People often look at me with confusion when I ask them what their only one in the room story is. They think it has to be like mine, where I went to a 600-person event and discovered that I was the only Black person there. I know. Horrifying, right? Hi, I'm Laura Cathcart-Robbins, and I am the host and creator of the podcast Only One in the Room. Every week, my co-host Scott Slaughter and I invite you to join us for an hour and lose yourself in someone's only one story. This podcast is for anyone who has ever felt alone in a room full of people, which is to say that this podcast is for everyone.
And we're back. So of the information that we know about Catalina, the actual person, I think you said she was, at one point, charges were brought up for the death of 40 of her workers. Mm-hmm. So that did actually happen. She was investigated for that.
Mm-hmm. And that's it. It was horrible. Certainly was a horrible thing to happen. But if we look at these 40 workers who died in the hands or because of the misadministration of that specific land estate, if we look at these numbers in the sort of overall context of the agrarian violence that was pervasive in colonial Chile and still in modern Chile, the agrarian society is extremely violent. If we look in which corporal punishment was the norm, was allowed. And there was this huge gap between those who were in power, I mean, that is the owners of the land, and those who were not, that is the workers. Violence was corporal punishment, violence, killings were the norm. And almost everybody in the landed elite of colonial Chile did engage in this kind of activities. Vicuña Maquena picked the case of Doña Catalina because of her profile served very nicely to his purposes. But workers died all the time, at all times during colonial Chile, in the agrarian side in the countryside of the colony.
I was so happy when I found your paper that I read about La Quintrala, because when I started reading about her, there's so much written about the myth and the monster. When I found your paper, I was trying to find anything that was actual historical information. But it seems like at the very beginning of our conversation, you made the distinction. There's the Catalina, there's the woman, and then there's the monster. And the monster, there's so much more written about.
Again, when you have a good story, you have a good story. And Vicuña Maquena, God, he had a very good story. That's part of his genius, I would say, as a writer. I guess to a certain extent, all historians, we do know that as historians, right? When you have a good story, you know it because your audience wants to know more about that. So happens that most of us, at least modern historians, we do pay attention to our sources, and we do pay attention to questioning our sources with a grain of salt. That's what we do by training. But that kind of restrictions were not part of the way in which Vicuña Maquena understood his role as historian. In his mind, like in the minds of intellectuals at the time, history was to serve as an educational tool. So notions from the past, stories from the past, information from the past was to serve as a way to educate. The role of the historians, Vicuña Maquena was very clear about that, is to educate people. And you educate people using a good story, not using abundant information.
I was just imagining if you or anyone publishing academic papers now said, there's no evidence for this, but just trust me, it happened, like he was able to do.
Yeah, you would not go very far into this profession if you do that.
Yeah, but so I'm also curious to know, you mentioned being told as a girl, if you don't do this, La Quintrala will come. Do you remember any other examples of, as a child, just what you heard about La Quintrala?
Oh, so I did grow up in the northern provinces of Chile, and the north is very native. So there is a strong native influence in what is nowadays northern Chile. And but in this case, not Mapuche natives, but Aymara natives. So spiritual alternative practices, for lack of a better word, are very prominent in native societies. And those practices borrow from Catholicism as well as from native traditions. So there's a mixing also there. And I recall that, for instance, women who would have a reputation of being a witch or healers would claim as a sort of publicity to their services that, I use the ghost of La Quintrala to potentiate, to enhance my powers. So trust me, I'm better than everybody else. Just pay for my services because I work with La Quintrala, which is fascinating in itself, how people of Aymara origins practicing healing, which incorporates elements of Catholicism, at the same time are borrowing from this collectively constructed monster. Surely without knowing the origins. But I guess at that point, when you have a good story, as I said, it doesn't matter, right? What kind of information. People do not care in this case. That non-specialists, let's say, would not care about what are the sources of information.
But I would think too, just La Quintrala being sounds like the most famous monster in Chilean history. So of course that's...
And if I can harness that and I can keep it under control, look at me, what kind of spiritual services I'm offering, right?
And just the people, everyone would know what you're talking about because that's the most famous. I find it so interesting that this is the most famous monster in Chilean culture, and it is based on a real woman, but there's such a strange path from her and who she was. McKenna really popularizing this story, and now it seems like. And didn't you say part of why he did that was Chile was developing its own independent culture, and so he wanted to have figures that everybody could unite around?
Yeah, it's called the foundational narratives. So the idea is that, this the notion by Benedict Anderson. His book came when I started grad school, which is some time ago. And the idea that nations, modern nations, as in nation states, in the 19th century of after colonial period, nations are created, nations are invented. There has to be some form of speech, of discourse that is created that would create this notion of affiliation. So, we are Chileans because this is what we share. We are Peruvians because this is what we share. And, you name it, multiply it around Latin America. So the 19th century is this sort of fertile ground for the creation, and intellectuals do that. Intellectuals from the local bourgeoisie, by the way, they do that. They create these stories that would be the foundational fiction of who Chileans are, what makes Chileans common, what would make you recognize each other as Chileans. And so the creation of these foundational fictions are fundamental to create this notion of collectivity. Think about this. I mean, these are countries that are being created, nation states that are being created, putting together people very different from each other. And that were kept into those separate labels by the colonial administration, right? The Spanish Empire recognized the natives, and the Spaniards as separate groups, legally separated. The Spanish administration did not recognize itself the category of mixed race, although everybody was mixed race. So when the new countries sort of start trying to organize these newly independent republics, they need to come out with something, with a story, that creates reality. And this is exactly what foundational fictions like Quintrala do. They create a reality, a common past that would serve people to sort of identify themselves as part of a group.
Is the main way that La Quintrala or Catalina is remembered now is through the storytelling, or is there any sort of building or memorial, or is there any sort of place people go, or is it does she stay alive through these stories mostly?
I think it's just stories. I don't know about a grave or a sort of a place that can, commemorate, or this is where the physical Doña Catalina can be found. I believe that there is none. So most of what we know about her is passed through stories, and which are collective creations as well, in which it's again the marvelous side of oral communication, right? So everybody adds something in the compound. It becomes something that we can all identify as horrible, as bad, as something that we don't want to be. It's the monster, becomes the monster, collectively constructed monster that shows us the limits of who we are and what we should not become. Which is a fascinating process in which storytelling precedes social reality.
That I love that whole angle of it, and I love you teach a course about monsters. That sounds wonderful. Do you have any other, just in terms of like beginning to wrap up our discussion, were there any other things you wanted to share about the story of La Quintrala?
I guess the story of La Quintrala can also be placed in a larger narrative per se, which is something that I'm interested in studying, is the notion, the category of those who are in between. In societies that cast each other as separate, as composed by separate groups that are at war against them, they're so different from each other. Spaniards and natives are supposedly so different from each other. In these societies, the creation of the positioning of some individuals as in between are fascinating in itself, are a fascinating topic in itself. So from her position of being in between, being a woman who clearly shares some cultural traits with natives, with Spaniards, and with Germans. In that situation, La Quintrala can be placed into the context of those agents of go-betweenness in colonial society, in situation of coloniality. And from that viewpoint, for instance, an interesting reflection can be elicited when we place La Quintrala vis-a-vis, for instance, with La Malinche, in the case of the Mexican, or in the case of the United States, with the case of Sacagawea, right? So those women who can navigate to different cultures and act as translators. But like Doña Catalina was not a translator, right? But these other women were. And in that sense, also, we can add men into as agents of in-betweenness, right? I'm thinking about, for instance, in the case of Yucatan, Gonzalo Guerrero, the Spanish soldier who ended up becoming Maya, and he rose to the rank of Mayan general and fought against the Spaniards. So I think in the studies of cultural encounters, that are also that, in essence, the story of imperial expansion. The notion that I think there is a very important niche of research when we think about those who were neither here nor there. And what does it tell us about personal agency. What does it tell us about the possibilities, the porosity of these two cultures that allow for this kind of exchanges to take place and be encapsulated in one single individual? And why that single individual ends up being ends up normally in all these stories, this person who is in between ends up being dead, meets a bad end. And there is a reason for that. There is a reason for that, because the person who is in between is extremely dangerous for everybody else. So we know what happened to La Malinche, for instance. We know what happened to the case of Guerrero. So the fact that those people who are in between are either killed, they meet a bad end, or they are monsters. It's an important component of how we should be thinking about cultural encounters in a situation of coloniality.
I guess I do just want to clarify as well that Catalina, the person, as far as I have read, she lived to... She was not put to death. She did not die tragically young. She just lived sort of an average lifespan. Her
60-something, yeah.
Yeah, there was nothing. So the monstrousness is really about how allegedly she lived her life, and then she has this long afterlife as the monster, but she doesn't have the same sort of tragic end as like La Malinche, for instance.
That's a good point. Yeah, that's true. She dies of old age at 60-something in her own house. And yeah, so she was not punished for her crimes, for her in-betweenness by human law. But in Vicuña Maquena's narrative, her soul, right, is the one who is being punished in hell, because her soul went to hell. And that's where she met eternal punishment. So in the afterlife, Vicuña Maquena makes her pay for her alleged crimes when she was alive.
That's so interesting. And that's why she is this monster. She's this ghost doing scary things to frighten children, haunting people's computers.
She's in hell. That was her ultimate punishment for all the crimes that she committed.
Exactly. So so that really does line up with what you're saying. If you're not people like La Malinche, who I did do an episode about her a bit ago, but she died very young. And so that could be seen as sort of her punishment for being in between. And then even somebody like La Quintrala, who lived longer, she's punished eternally in this other way. This is also interesting. I had sent you a list of, at the end of all my episodes where I profile a woman, I have these categories where I score, and I'm very interested, because this is a tricky one, because the real life person we don't know a lot about. So we might be scoring partially the monster. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
So the first category is how scandalous was this person? So I think we could think about Catalina herself in her life. She was charged with a crime, so seemingly she had some enemies. And her being a widow who didn't remarry, who was a landowner, on a scale of 0 to 10, how scandalous do you think she was?
I think it's pretty low.
Yeah.
I would say it's pretty low. The real one,
the real one. Yeah.
And the reason for that is because she was not doing anything out of the norm, anything that any other woman in the social situation, in this kind of society, would be doing for her clan. So she was also bribing authorities. She was also litigating. There are some documents that I found about that. She also had some problems with a local religious order because of borders of the land and state. She was not doing anything else that any other woman of her position in this society would have been doing. The death of these workers, again, yes, it was horrible. But in the context of the violence of the society, it was nothing out of the norm. She was peaked by the historians for that. And she was probably peaked because of the political power of the colonial society. The Lisbergers, her clan, are very important, and therefore they have many enemies. So there is some of the alleged crimes of the Lisberger women, for instance, her mother and her grandmother also have been accused of being of having killed men and of being witches. So the witchcraft runs in the family, says Vicuña Maquena. But her mother and her grandmother had also been accused of committing crimes by political rivals of the clan. So the sense is that in this kind of very litigious society, and where competition for very reduced resources is the norm, it's very easy. It's easier to pick on women of the clan than to go openly against the men of the clan.
Oh, that's such a good point. I was wondering why the women would be chosen, but you're right. It would be maybe less dangerous to go against the women than the men.
Yeah, of course. So in that sort of the real Doña Catalina, I don't think she was out of the norm at all.
Yeah, I would suggest on a scale of 0 to 10, I would give her a 1. And that's just because everybody was kind of scandalous.
I think so.
Everyone was the same.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even things like, the death of 40 workers is a lot of people. But I kept thinking, and I'm glad you just said that about the men versus women, but I'm sure there were men who were doing this sort of, who were treating the workers the same way. And they did not become the monsters.
Okay, yeah. Because in Vicuña Maquena's creation, she's a monster. And another historian put it in better terms that I did in my paper, but she's a monster because she's a woman with power, and therefore out of the power of men. So, and that's kind of important in the creation of the monster. She is so bad, not only because she has power, but because she exercises that power out of men control. She's not controlled by a husband. She's not controlled by the church. She's not controlled by the local authorities. And that's what makes her, in Vicuña Maquena's imagination, the real monster. That's the ultimate crime.
I think we'll just skip ahead to one of the other categories in my little scale is sexism. How much did sexism shape her life and her story? And I think that's a 10 out of 10.
That's a 10 out of 10, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Absolutely. That's everything you just said. The reason she was chosen by McKenna to be the monster was partially because of the mixed race, but largely because of she's a woman and look what she did. And the way you described her monstrosity is to show here's a woman doing all these things, and that's why women shouldn't do these things.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And that shows how rotten colonial times were, right? Because look what the colonial administration allowed to happen. This is a mistake that we as newly independent citizens of Chile should not allow to happen.
The next category, so it's the scheminess. Was she a person with schemes and plans? And again, not knowing that much about the real Catalina, but it sounds like she was effective as a landowner. She didn't need to find a husband. You said she had, what did you say? She had these legal disputes about land and territory. So she wasn't passive. She was active. And so in terms, like her schemes weren't necessarily to have sex with men and then kill them and then murder thousands of people. But in terms of the schemes to be an effective landowner,
I would give her a 10 there.
Okay.
She's effective. She's effective as a person, as an individual, and also as a member of this clan. Remember, she as everybody else in the society went through life as a member of a collectivity. And her clan was extremely rich, extremely powerful, very successful politically speaking, very successful in co-opting colonial authorities. And she was certainly a part of the game. She was a member, right, of this successful group of individuals. So that's maybe personally, I would say that she was very competent and she had a lot of agency, but also because her clan was successful.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very hard, I would say it's artificial to separate the individual from the individual success, from the collective success, political, economic success of her own extended family.
The final category, and I'm also curious what you're going to say, is the significance. And I think the significance of La Quintrala to Chilean culture seems 10 out of 10.
It's a 10 out of 10.
10, if I could do more. It would
yeah, definitely it's very high there.
Could not be more. Yeah. Which is also interesting that in the culture, this figure it's a female figure who is monstrous, but it seems like she's one of the most famous cultural figure.
Which says a lot about Chilean society, right?
And that's actually a question I had. One of my listeners who's in Peru had been to Chile, and he was impressed, and I think he said sort of pleased to see that there was a lot of there's a lot of women being celebrated in Chilean culture and society. That was his impression. Is that something that you would also recognize?
I think the election of President Michelle Bachelet, twice, mark a threshold in there, as in Chileans recognizing women and following women in a position of authority. So I think Chilean society has made a lot of advances in putting and selecting and implementing female leadership. So yes, I would agree with your viewer in that regard. Also, but however, I would give credits also to Peru. I think female leadership, questionable as it can be at times, is also gaining grounds in Peruvian society. Another element that we need to keep in mind is that economic agency and leadership for women is a cultural, is a variable that is culturally connected. So in native groups, for instance, which are in the case of Peru, there is a good size of Peruvian population is of native origins, and native communities are very important in Peru. We do know that native women do exercise more agency that we are bound to recognize from an outside perspective. That native women do run businesses, they make their political agents in their communities, and that is something that also we need to keep in mind. Women in Mapuche societies, women do have leadership. It's not out of the norm to see a woman in a position of leadership.
This is all, as somebody, I'm in Canada, so learning anything about Chilean history, Peruvian history, it's nothing I was ever taught in school. This is all brand new to me. And I really appreciate hearing this sort of background about the development of the society. And even as the Indigenous people have been the victims of the wars and the genocide, there's still this influence of the women. Perhaps that's part of why in Chilean or in Peruvian society there is that influence, because you said like the race mixing and the culture mixing, you can't fully separate them.
Yeah. My mentor in grad school put it very nicely. Her name was Susan Sokolov. So she said that in colonial society in Latin America, basically everybody was sleeping with everybody. And when you're having children in common, when you have this kind of intimate connections with somebody who is from a different culture, you cannot disaggregate cultural mestizaje from biological mestizaje. It's impossible. And I think she was right, definitely right.
As much as the Europeans would like to say, this is what it's like, everything, there's a strict division, that's what they wrote, that's what they recorded. But what we see, and through the oral storytelling, we see that's not true.
Yeah.
That's just what they wanted to say. Do you have any final thoughts about this, about Catalina or La Quintrala or this discussion?
I would, my summer, as I told you, I went this past summer to the archives in Seville, and thanks to support from my institution, from John Carroll University. And one of the things that discovered in the archives when I was following the Lisperger clan was all the bad things that male Lispergers were doing, all the kind of crimes that men of the Lisperger clan were committing, which are pretty bad, right? And but Vicuña Maquina did not pick on them for all the reasons that we are commenting. And so, for instance, there was a case that really struck me, in which I have it here. One of the uncles of Catalina, on the maternal side, the Lisperger, he basically, with the assistance of the entire clan, he basically raped the very young daughter of the new judge, Oidor, who had been sent to the colony of Chile to put legal order, right? So this guy, with the assistance of everybody in the clan, basically raped this 14-year-old girl who, from the description of the situation, seems that she had some learning needs at the age of 14. So this young girl is raped by this 40-something-year-old man. And he does it so as to get her pregnant, so as to be forced to marry her, because this is what he wants to happen. Because if he marries the daughter of this prominent judge, and the person who decides on legal cases, right, this judge would be bound to favor any kind of crime, to overlook any kind of crime that his own clan would be committing from now on. And this is the uncle of Doña Catalina. And Doña Catalina herself would have been, according to Vicuña Maquina, benefit from this same oidor sort of looking somewhere else, right, at the time when she's accused of the killing these 40 workers. So that demonstrates that, like probably any other extended family in colonial Chile, the Lispergers were pretty terrible people. And so in this context of this clan of monsters, let us say, Doña Catalina was probably not doing anything out of the norm. So the concepts of what is right, what is wrong, are very culturally connected, right? So for Vicuña Maquina, all these actions are horrible and are the clear encapsulation of why colonial system is so bad. But for people living in this situation, this is everyday life. This is what everybody did. And probably if this guy did not take the initiative with this young girl, another guy of another clan would have tried. So, yeah, I guess that is something that we need to keep in perspective when we're talking about bad people. Using the lens of another time to evaluate, to judge those actions.
It's true. And I've seen that. I'm thinking about things like ancient Egypt, Cleopatra, things like that, where if you're not being trying to murder your own family member, then they're going to murder you. So it's different to judge somebody for doing a thing when that's what the culture was. If you didn't do that, then you would probably just be murdered. So it's in the context of that, but as you said, the mixed race and that she was a woman. That's why she, out of this whole clan of monsters, and every other clan probably was monsters too, she became the one, as though she's the emblem of all of these people, when really everybody was kind of terrible.
Correct. Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking this time with me today.
Me.
Yeah, I'm so excited. I was so excited to find your paper at first. And then I love to talk to somebody who is so interested in the topic.
I immensely enjoy our conversation. Thank you.
If you're interested in reading the paper that Maria wrote, that is how I found her and was able to come and get her to come on the podcast, I'll put a link to that in the show notes. It was in an academic journal called History Compass. If you're at a university, you can probably access that, but because universities have ways to access academic papers, it's just really interesting. And I was really appreciative of the work that she was sharing in that paper and that she shared on this episode as well today, just about what was the real story of the real Catalina as far as we know, what was it like in Chile at this time, and the monster of La Quintrala, and kind of how did that all come to be. So thank you so much for listening to Vulgar History. I have a couple announcements, which is what I like to do at the end of the episode. I hope everyone, you know what, I don't. Everyone, God bless. Do what you want to do. But if you want to listen to some announcements at the end of the episode, that's when I do them. So if you're curious about La Quintrala and where she scored on the Fredegund Memorial Scandalicious Scale as compared to other people who we've done on the podcast, the full scale is actually posted on the website, vulgarhistory.com. There's a thing at the very top of that page that says scores, so you can just kind of compare where people go. Actually, I'm curious because La Quintrala is there with a 31. Elizabeth Bathory, 29. Just the two stories, I'd see them relating in my mind as just kind of women who really lived and whose stories then developed into that of a serial killer monster. And what does that have to do with the real person who lived? Debatable. Anyway, if you kind of want to see just where your fave compares, just vulgarhistory.com. And then the scores are there as well. And I want to make sure that the things I'm saying are true for the day when this episode actually comes out for you. So you're listening to this, and it is March 27th, 2024, or whatever day you're listening to this in the future or the past, ? Anyway, yeah, so it's just coming towards the end of March. So I'm still going to be posting an open thread to talk about The Tower, which is this month's Vulgar History book club. I'm not going to do a book club every month, but just when there's a book I'm really passionate about that's really vulgar history coded, I'll be doing a book club. And so this week we'll be having our wrap-up discussion about that book. If you've had a chance to read it, you can share your thoughts on Patreon or also on Instagram. I post on the grid every Wednesday. Also, I think I've mentioned this on the podcast, but I should mention it again because I'm not good at remembering what to mention. So I also have started a Substack newsletter, which is free. And it's I consider it a companion to this podcast. So it's not like I post a podcast and then I do a Substack about the same person. I've been sharing some of my other writing on the Substack about people who I haven't talked about on the podcast before and who I don't know if I ever will talk about on the podcast, but they're people who I have researched in the past. And currently I'm doing the wives of Henry VIII. So in a series called Tudor, I hardly knew her. And this week on the Substack, I'm talking about Catherine Howard, which is she's maybe my favorite of the wives, just because she's kind of the most scandalicious and also kind of the most trashy. And that's the sort of person I like best, but it's also one of the saddest stories. Anyway, if you want to follow that, which again is free, and which again is optional, It's really running parallel to the podcast. Like it's called Vulgar History a la carte, but it's telling different stories of what I'm doing on the podcast. And it's because in this kind of post-Twitter world, I'm just trying to figure out what makes sense for me and what sort of online presence just feels the most comfortable and natural. And I was a writer before I was a podcaster, and I really like sharing my writing and I like doing writing. And so, yeah, anyway, it's vulgarhistory.substack.com, but there is a little link in the show notes for that as well. If you also want to keep up with me and what I'm doing, and if you're just like, I need more Anne Foster voice in my ears, there's all kinds of bonus episodes on Patreon. So that's where you can get early ad-free access to all of the episodes, upcoming episodes and also past episodes. So if you pledge at least $1 a month, you get the early ad-free access, and you don't have to listen to that on Patreon. Once you subscribe there, you can hook that up to your Spotify or to Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening to your podcast. So you can get that ad-free early access. That's for $1 or more a month. If you pledge at least $5 or more a month, you also get the bonus episodes, which is Vulgar Piece Theater, which is where I talk about costume dramas with people from the podcast, Allison Epstein and Lana Wood Johnson. The most recent episode was a little contentious. We talked about a movie called The Brotherhood of the Wolf, which I chose. And anyway, Allison and Lana thought differently about it from me, and we had a whole conversation. Those episodes are all like 3 hours long. So if you really want to have some more Anne Foster voice in your ears, that's where you can. So pledge at least $5 or more. $5 or more on Patreon to get access to Vulgar Piece Theater. Or if you just want to listen to that episode, you can always just purchase the newest episodes of Vulgar Piece Theater on Patreon as well for just $5, and you have it, then you own it. Also on Patreon recently, I did so this asshole John Knox, which is an hour and 15 minutes of me trying to be as fair as I possibly can about John Knox. And I read a whole biography about him. I've learned lots of things about him. It includes the beard origin story, which is actually kind of interesting how he decided to grow an incredibly long beard. And it's because he was in cosplay as his favorite preacher. Anyway, if you want to listen to that, that's also available for the $5 a month on Patreon, or you can just buy it for $5 on Patreon. And I will also mention our brand partner, Common Era Jewelry. So this is a 100% woman-owned business who makes beautiful pieces of jewelry with women from history and or mythology on them. So this includes some people we've talked about on the podcast, some people who we're going to be talking about on the podcast. In fact, one of the people that you can get on a necklace is a person we'll be talking about next week on the podcast. So people we've talked about before. She has got beautiful pieces, Boudica, Cleopatra, Agrippina. There's a beautiful Anne Boleyn necklace. I have that one. There's also ones from mythology like Medusa. I bought that one as well. Sappho, lots of different people. And also you could just look at her website, the Difficult Women collection, and try to guess who next week's subject is going to be for. She's on a necklace that after I researched this person, I also bought that necklace because I became obsessed. Anyway, so if you want to get 15% off of a purchase from Common Era, go to commonera.com/vulgar or use code vulgar at checkout. That's 15% off anything from Common Era at commonera.com/vulgar, or use code vulgar at checkout. If you want to buy Vulgar History merchandise, that's at vulgarhistory.com/store. That's best for Americans. Actually, recently, I'll tell you. And if you're outside the US, the more international friendly shop with better shipping is vulgarhistory.redbubble.com. And I recently just added a classic design back to the collection because if you are following the latest British royal family drama, or if you just follow the British royal family in general, or if you just like excellence on TikTok, you might know Amanda Matta. She does Matta of Fact is her name on TikTok, and she does really smart, really like intersectional feminist discussions of what's going on with the royal family, which lately has been absolute chaos. Anyway, she's also a friend of the podcast. And one of her recent TikToks, she was wearing one of our older merch designs, which is the Mazarinets, which was sort of an astrology-inspired design that I put out the week that the 5 weeks we were doing the Hortense Mancini episodes. Anyway, because Amanda wore that, I was like, that was a good design. And also because maybe you want to dress like her. I relaunched that design. And so it's back in both of the merch stores if you want to get the Mazarinets. And also, speaking of, you know what, not even my merch store, but somebody else's merch store. There's a thing that I say on this podcast that I started saying uncontrollably, because what I do is I listen to all kinds of different podcasts, including the Double Love, the SVH, Sweet Valley High podcast, which is hosted by two amazing women in Ireland. And they are the ones who started saying, Herman, my pills. And then I had been binging all of their episodes, and I didn't start talking with an Irish accent, although I was close to it. There was an episode of this podcast where I used the word lads, but they just said Herman, my pills. And it's a thing that they say when just when somebody is being shocked by something scandalous that somebody is doing. They started saying it. So then I started saying it on this podcast, because when you listen to enough episodes of a podcast, you kind of start thinking in their words. Anyway, it's a thing that I started saying, inspired by them. And the Double Love podcast, they've just put out some new merch, including a sticker that says Herman, my pills. And so I have to give a plug to they have a Redbubble store as well, which is at, I think it's just doublelovepod.redbubble.com, but I'll put a link to the Herman, my pills sticker for sure in the show notes, because I know I've ordered one. And also you can get in touch with me. I mentioned that this episode's topic was suggested by Javi, who heard my plea for suggestions of people from different countries in the world. If you have a suggestion of a person that you'd like to see in the podcast, or any other things you want to share with me, there's a form to contact me at vulgarhistory.com, or you can also email me at vulgarhistorypod@gmail.com. I'm also on Instagram at vulgarhistorypod, where you can also send me a DM if you want. Transcripts of recent episodes are available at vulgarhistory.com. Thank you to Aveline Malik for providing these transcripts. And finally, next week, we'll be back with one of the women from the Common Era Difficult Women collection. It's going to be a long episode. It's one of my favorite episodes because it features one of my favorite returning guests. Anyway, so stay tuned for that next week. It's going to be a super special, extra long episode, much like this was a super special, extra long extra. Anyway, until next time, my friends, keep your pants on and your tits out. Vulgar History is hosted, written, and researched by Anne Foster and edited by Christina Lumagi.
Ah, the web tore. Those that both created and were created by the threads disentangle from the fringes to feast on the very thing that spawned them.
What's up, Tilly? This is how you deal with weird!
No! Do not harm my children!
Oh, you lost a feather. Can I keep it?
No, you can't force me to!
Do you know what lies within nothing?
Rocket's in trouble, Akasa! Can we turn on the windshield remotely?
No, she could lose her job as an Akasar.
I don't fear Vehar.
No, but you fear me. If you intend to trick me, I will not hesitate to sever the oath bond entirely.
Why didn't you help me? Coward! I don't have a parachute! I don't like free falling!
Counterbalance, a high fantasy audio drama. Season 2, coming 15th of October 2023. Learn more on trilunas.com.